Marawa, Deputy Chad, Cornel Pewewardy. I greet you in my language, Comanche. I acknowledge the indigenous lands, California, the ancestors here in this area of the University of Oregon. I'd like to start out with some humor. I'd like to share with you some satire, and just let you know where I'm coming from as an indigenous person on this North American continent. Do you know why the American astronauts are going to Mars? They heard that there was an Indian living on Mars with 1 acre of land. And they had to have it. And on that 1 acre was a casino. And he was an Indian mascot. First and foremost, I'd like to state I'm post-Indian, but I don't live in a post-racial world. And because of my consciousness, I don't live in a colorblind society. I don't even live in two worlds. I live in one world, which consists of multiple cultural lenses, and yet they're intertribal and multicultural. And being colorblind in today's society is yet another form of racism. This phenomenon of using Indian mascots as race-based sports mascots and nicknames in K-12 schools in Oregon, universities, and professional sports teams across the country is the subject of my TED Talk today here at the University of Oregon. I want to preface this talk by saying that I affirm diversity themes of this series of TED Talks. Affirming diversity is congruent with learning theory, so campuses that I speak across the country, the issues of Indian mascots is usually at the entry level of consciousness and novice in discourse. Like the University of Oregon, many other fine institutes of higher education in the United States have diversity goals written in their overall strategic plans. Goals that directly address creating a respectful, warm environment that affirms diversity on an intersection of differences. Ironically, for many ethnic groups in this country, culture is not educational. Like in the case of indigenous peoples, ethnic culture in America is pure entertainment. It's American as apple pie and baseball, corn dogs, and the county fair. Playing Indian, however, has been an American phenomenon, and playing Indian at school is not congruent with affirming diversity, nor shall it be an enactment, be a part of any diversity learning goals in the teaching and learning process. The main problem with using race-based Indian mascots in schools is that it's creating a hostile environment within an educational sponsorship. I'm here to tell you a short story about a national controversy in using the image of indigenous people as sports mascots and nicknames in schools, as well as provide with you some tangible solutions to really honor Native America. Ultimately, myth-making is what the story of Indian mascots used in school is all about, simply because he created it and therefore has a possessive investment in whiteness to keep their mascot, their image. Decades in the making, mainstream media and Walt Disney films together helped burn the noble savage archetype image into the American imagination, which includes many indigenous peoples too. By design or default today in 2014, American Indian mascots are the creation of the machinery of whiteness first imposed upon indigenous people in the early 1900s, the football team Carlisle in Pennsylvania by white sports writers from Eastern mainstream newspapers. Generally, over time, the concept of Indian in the American cultural imagination fed the thirst for the empirical nostalgia within mainstream schools and sports culture and media. Consequently, the American football team, Carlisle, had no say in the creation of its original Indian mascot in 1912. The introduction of the Indian mascot at Carlisle was a creation of white sports writers simply because the football team was new in collegiate play and had to follow the cultural patterns of mainstream sports that had already established mascots like the lions, the tigers, the bears, and so forth and so on. One of the first sure signs of redfacing, another form of playing Indian, could be found in the historic Boston Tea Party of 1773, whereas Tea Party participants disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. This event is a catalyst moment in American history, burned into the American consciousness, all the way down to elementary school teachers to adult politicians. Creating Indian mascots in schools created a historical cultural marker, thereby Americans redefining themselves as something other than British colonists. They reinvented communities across the country of themselves into Indians, mostly Plains Indians, and for the next 200 years, white Americans molded themselves into similar ethnic narratives of a newer national identity, rejecting an older European ethnic label while at the same time trying to shed away the colonizers' consciousness. Through white identity performances, most Indian mascots yesterday and today preferred Plains Indians as static and stereotype symbols for what they saw as real Indians. Ironically, this homogenized version of the Plains Indian as a sports mascot distorts the diversity of hundreds of tribes in North America. This distorted perception is what I call disconscious racism, like in the word dysfunctional, D-Y-S. A disconscious perception is so far removed from the reality of daily tribal life that the individual doesn't even know that they have a distorted view of ethnic images because they are still cultural spectators outside of the culture. Out of sight, out of mind. Therefore, red-facing, playing Indian, is a persistent tradition in American culture stretching as far back as the Boston Tea Party, later instituting an Indian nickname during the Colonial Indian School days in its era, and it still exists today. Kill the Indian, save the man was the theme. Stereotyping and power is mutually enforcing because ethnic stereotyping itself exerts control, maintaining and justifying the status quo settler hegemony. And of course, when we try to bring this phenomenon to the American public as a multicultural teaching moment and try to change it, I'm reminded of 500 years of resistance to European colonization and 100 years of pushback on the Indian mascot controversy, mostly by settler hegemony. Resistance to eliminating Indian mascots, framed within the form of political correctness discourse, is a classic example of white identity performances and the classic example of the politics of distraction. In the post-civil rights era, I've witnessed many obvious defensive tactics occurring, particularly within the English nomenclature, surfacing the mainstream media by language architects or words and terms designed to frighten marginalized people away from reframing and retelling our cultural stories, terms like politically correct or correctness. In my analysis, these are xenophobic coded terms created by people outside of our own cultural groups who try to detour our groups from the understanding of our cultural struggles and our stories. In the academic arena, the spirit of my work on this topic is to be academically correct or culturally correct or not politically correct or just be correct. But sometimes when my students hear the xenophobic coded terms used in public spaces like political correctness, it's enough for some of them to be embarrassed and rethink their thinking and to say the social desirable terms. And of course, as educators, we know that this strategy trivializes the nature of the discourse. An article that I wrote titled 100 Defensive Tactics details the reaction response of those individuals or groups that want to keep their Indian mascot. The most popular defensive tactic used to keep the Indian mascot is, "But we are honoring you," or what about the Irish? The classic concept of this white identity performance is what I call the politics of distraction, executed mostly by friends of the Indian. But when Indian people or indigenous people get caught up in this colonial quagmire, many are politically solicited by outsiders white investors trying their hardest to get the local tribal supportive endorsement so schools can continue to use their Indian mascots. And of course, I'm showing you some of the archetypes that have been burnt into the American psyche. This phenomenon results in another type of colonization, which I call recolonization of the American sports culture. The construction of the noble savage occurred over the years mostly by Hollywood celebrities like Kevin Costner, who embellished this archetype in the movies like Dances with Wolves. Costner goes native. Following the footsteps in the noble savage narrative were films like Avatar, the noble savage in sci-fi, and last year's Lone Ranger and Tonto. And in the Disney film, Johnny Depp continues an ongoing legacy of the possessive investment in whiteness because he too goes native in the wild, wild West, which is a schizophrenic process of searching for a national identity. In their quest for reinventing a national identity, many of these Hollywood movie stars enact a widespread white male settler fantasy in their quest to belong in the Americas. So therefore, they play Indian on the Hollywood silver screen, reinforcing the racial hierarchy of a white male privilege, playing off America's sense of cultural guilt that tried to systematically eliminate the indigenous peoples from North America. Go, whiteys, go! Go, African Americans, go, Asians, go, Hispanics, go. Whatever the ethnic group, we can spin the deal in the same way as this picture suggests. In their quest for reinventing a national identity, many of these settlers look at this kind of phenomenon. The contemporary image of indigenous peoples today hasn't changed much in 100 years since they invented stereotypes created by the scriptwriters and influential newspaper writers at the turn of the 21st century. Those culturally responsive educators committed to challenging these externally imposed stereotypes and invented images face daily challenges and multiple microaggressions when we start to deconstruct a European colonial gaze of indigenous peoples. This Sartesian gaze includes many indigenous people who may not have looked at how our ethnic images were first manufactured within the machinery of whiteness, rather than from our own tribal specific perspective, and working to transform the stereotype images of indigenous people is the essence of my work in higher education. And through our individual work to decolonize ourselves, we can connect and we can collaborate and change the way we look at ourselves in the world, which we can change how we are seen by people outside of our cultures and decide for ourselves who we want to be seen by and who we want to be. In this process, we create a worldview where everybody can look at us not as Indians, but as real human beings indigenous to the North America with a new, healthier consciousness. And why this is an important issue? It's about raising children in a non-racist, multicultural society. So some strategies, some tangible strategies, if they could be acknowledge the tribal lands for where schools exist, whose indigenous lands is written within the school's history, just like Professor Jerry did. Acknowledge the indigeneity across the continent. Create college scholarships for Native American students in each school system. Recruit and hire Native teachers within each school system, professional positions. Recruit and hire administrators in school districts. Elect natives to the local school board and state board of education. Integrate Native content across K-12 school systems, the curriculum. Send teachers, administrators, parents, and school board members to Native Indigenous conferences, symposiums, workshops, Oregon Indian Education Association, the National Association for Multicultural Education, National Indian Education Association, and many more. Language tribal sovereignty into the mission statement and strategy plans within each one of those schools. Build professional and collaboration partnerships with the local Native Studies programs in higher education or tribally controlled community colleges. And work with the Native communities to replace Indian mascots with each one of these schools. Because when you do that, you heal the past. You celebrate when you retire each one of those schools. You work together to heal the past within oneself. And so I know these are only a few, but it's better. It's better than being used as an Indian mascot in schools. In this day and age of affirming diversity. And so one of my strategies is right here, a letter to the editor, already queued up, whether it be TNT, ESPN, CBS Sports, or ABC Sports, whatever it may be that the national networks are carrying, because what I come to find out, there's terminology, this language of savagism still is between the commentator's microphone and the national audience. And so many times the commentators in basketball will say, he's dribbling down the court and he's going to have that tomahawk chop. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, why infuse a race-based term? Why don't you just say something neutral, just say slam dunk? But that's not in their consciousness. And just like some teachers will say to the children, get in a circle, let's sit down Indian style. Oh my goodness, you wouldn't say sit down black man style, Asian style, white man style, Mexican style, but you said sit down Indian style. That's that disconscious racism interfering. And so, in conclusion, what I'd like to say, I'm not your Indian mascot anymore, and I thank you, and I'll sing you a song that comes from the American Indian movement. Thank you.